The morning shift at the Imperial Palace started the same way it always did for Ben. He pushed his cleaning cart through the marble corridors, whistling softly while the golden sunrise cast long shadows across floors so polished they looked like mirrors. Most folks would think working as a janitor in the most powerful building in the Draconian Empire was glamorous, but Ben knew better. The dragons who ran this place barely noticed him. To them, he was just another human doing the work they considered beneath their dignity. Ben had been cleaning these halls for 3 years now, and he'd learned the palace's rhythm. Morning council meetings happened on the upper floors where the ceilings soared 50 feet high and crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls. The nobles would argue about border disputes and trade routes while Ben scrubbed their floors. Afternoon sessions moved to the East Wing where military commanders planned their strategies. By evening, the social chambers filled with laughter and the scent of exotic foods Ben couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. But there were other parts of the palace too. Forgotten corners where the grandeur faded into simple utility. Maintenance corridors that connected the public spaces, service tunnels where the heating systems ran, storage rooms filled with old furniture and outdated technology. Ben knew them all. Sometimes he ate his lunch in these quiet spaces, enjoying the solitude away from the barely concealed disdain of the dragon nobility. That morning, Ben had just finished the main gallery and was heading toward the maintenance wing when he heard it. A soft whimpering sound, almost like a wounded animal. He paused, tilting his head. The sound came again, weaker this time. Ben abandoned his cart and followed the noise down a side corridor he rarely used. The lights here flickered occasionally, and dust gathered in corners that no one bothered to clean. He found the boy crumpled against the wall near a heating vent. Even through the dim lighting, Ben could see the scales that marked him as dragonborn. They shimmered with an unhealthy dullness, lacking the usual iridescent gleam. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old in human terms. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps, and his small body trembled with fever. Ben dropped to his knees beside the boy. Heat radiated from the child's skin like a furnace. The young dragon's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed with sickness. Ben had seen plenty of sick kids during his time working in the lower city hospitals before this job. This wasn't just a common cold or flu. This was serious. "Hey there, buddy," Ben said softly, keeping his voice calm. "Can you tell me your name?" The boy's lips moved but no sound came out. His scales, Ben noticed, bore markings he'd seen before in the palace chronicles displayed in the public museum. Royal markings. This wasn't just any dragon child. This was a prince. Ben's mind raced. He should call for help, alert the palace guards, find someone important. But something stopped him. This corridor was far from the main palace areas. No one came here by accident. If this child was sick and alone in a forgotten maintenance tunnel, it meant something had gone very wrong. Either the prince had wandered here in his fevered state, or worse, someone had left him here deliberately. The boy whimpered again, his small hand clutching at nothing. Ben made his decision in that instant. He'd worked around dragons long enough to know their culture placed enormous emphasis on strength and perfection. Weakness was shameful. Illness was disgraceful. He'd heard whispers in the servant quarters about dragon children who showed signs of imperfection, how they sometimes just disappeared from court life. Ben stripped off his work jacket and wrapped it around the shivering prince. The child was lighter than he expected, despite the density that came with dragon physiology. Ben lifted him carefully, cradling the boy against his chest. The prince's head lolled against Ben's shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. "All right, kid, we're going to get you some help," Ben murmured. "Just hang on for me." He knew the palace layout better than most of the nobles who lived here. The main medical wing was 15 floors up, but that meant going through public corridors past guards and courtiers. They'd stop him immediately. A human touching royalty violated about a dozen different protocols, maybe more. But Ben also knew the service routes, the hidden arteries of the palace that kept the whole massive structure functioning. Ben moved quickly through the maintenance tunnels, his boots echoing on metal grating. The prince's fever burned through his jacket. Time was running out. Whatever was wrong with this child, it was getting worse by the minute. Ben's arms ached from the weight, but he pushed forward, climbing access ladders with the boy held carefully against him with one arm. He emerged from a service door near the medical wing, and immediately 2 dragon guards turned toward him, their eyes widening in shock at the sight of a human janitor carrying a royal child. The 2 guards moved faster than Ben thought possible. One moment they were standing at attention, the next they had him surrounded, their ceremonial spears crossed in front of him like a barrier. The taller guard's scales flashed crimson with anger, a color Ben had learned meant serious trouble. "Put down the prince immediately," the guard hissed, his voice carrying that particular resonance that made Dragon's speech sound like distant thunder. "Step away from the royal child, human." Ben tightened his grip on the unconscious boy. "He needs a doctor. Right now. He's burning up with fever and I found him alone in the maintenance corridor. Something's really wrong with him." The second guard, shorter but broader, leaned in to examine the prince. His eyes widened in recognition. "That's Prince Cavith, the Emperor's youngest son." He looked at Ben with something between horror and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Touching royalty is forbidden. The contamination protocols alone." Contamination. Ben felt his temper rising. "This kid is dying and you're worried about protocols? Just get him to a doctor." The taller guard was already speaking rapidly into a communication device on his wrist. Within seconds, the corridor filled with more guards, palace officials, and finally, a trio of dragon physicians in flowing silver robes. They approached with deliberate slowness, their faces twisted in disgust as they looked at Ben holding the prince. The lead physician, an elderly dragon with deep blue scales and cold amber eyes, circled around Ben like he was examining a peculiar specimen. "The child has been touched by a human. This is unprecedented. Completely unacceptable." "He was alone and sick," Ben said, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "I was trying to help him." "Help?" The physician's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You've contaminated him. Royal bloodlines must remain pure. Physical contact with lesser species violates every medical principle we hold sacred." He turned to his colleagues. "We cannot treat him in this state. The child must undergo purification rituals first. It will take days to arrange the proper ceremonies." Ben stared at them in disbelief. "Days? Look at him. He doesn't have days. His fever is spiking. Whatever's wrong with him needs treatment now, not after some ceremony." The physician's eyes narrowed. "You dare instruct me on medical matters? Guards, remove this human from the palace. Place him in detention for his crimes against the royal family." Two guards reached for Ben, but he stepped back, still holding Cavith close. The boy had stopped whimpering now, which was somehow worse than the crying. His breathing had become irregular, each breath a struggle. "Please," Ben said, looking at each of the physicians in turn. "I don't care what you do to me afterwards. Arrest me, throw me in prison, whatever. Just help him first. He's a child. Your prince. Doesn't that mean anything?" The elderly physician's expression hardened. "It means everything. Which is why we cannot treat him while he carries the contamination of human contact. The shame to the royal house would be immeasurable. The boy's condition, whatever it may be, is less important than maintaining the purity of the imperial bloodline." Something in those words made Ben's blood run cold. They weren't going to help. They were actually going to let this child die rather than bend their rules. He looked around at the assembled dragons, searching for any sign of sympathy or reason. He found nothing but cold stares and barely concealed contempt. Ben made his decision in a heartbeat. He turned and ran. Shouts erupted behind him. Heavy footsteps thundered in pursuit. Ben knew the service corridors better than any guard, but he also knew he couldn't outrun dragons for long. Their strength and speed far exceeded human capabilities. He needed to reach somewhere safe, somewhere they might actually help Cavith. He burst through a maintenance door and found himself in a service elevator that connected to the lower city. The human sectors. Ben jabbed the button for the ground level and the doors slid closed just as the first guard rounded the corner. A massive clawed hand smashed into the closing doors, but they held. The elevator descended rapidly, and Ben could hear alarms starting to sound throughout the palace. He'd just kidnapped a prince. There would be no talking his way out of this. But as he looked down at Cavith's pale face, feeling the boy's labored breathing against his chest, Ben knew he'd made the right choice. The elevator opened into the lower city, a stark contrast to the palace's grandeur. Here, humans and aliens of a dozen different species lived and worked in crowded conditions. The streets were narrow and bustling with activity. Ben pushed through the crowds, ignoring the startled looks from people who recognized the palace uniform he still wore. He knew exactly where he needed to go. 3 blocks east, tucked between a noodle shop and a parts dealer, stood a small clinic. The sign above the door read Mitchell Medical Services, in 3 different languages. Ben had passed it 1,000 times on his way to work. Now he prayed they could help. Ben kicked open the clinic door, startling a waiting room full of patients. A woman in a white coat looked up from behind the reception desk, her eyes going wide as she saw what Ben carried. "I need Dr. Mitchell," Ben gasped out of breath. "Now. This boy is dying." Dr. Rachel Mitchell took one look at the unconscious dragon prince in Ben's arms and her professional instincts kicked in immediately. She was a woman in her late 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd seen every medical emergency imaginable in the lower city. "Exam room 2 now," she barked, clearing a path through the waiting patients. "Someone call Dr. Hayes from upstairs. Tell him we need him immediately." Ben followed her into a small examination room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. The equipment looked old but well-maintained, nothing like the gleaming technology in the palace medical wing. Rachel gestured to the exam table and Ben gently laid Kavith down. The boy's scales had lost almost all their color now, faded to an ashy gray that looked terribly wrong. Rachel's hands moved over the prince with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse, his breathing, the temperature of his scales. Her face grew more concerned with each passing second. A younger doctor rushed in, a tall man with kind eyes and premature wrinkles from too many late-night shifts. "Rachel, what we got?" Dr. Hayes asked, moving to the opposite side of the exam table. "Dragon juvenile, maybe 8 or 9 years old, severe fever, depressed respiratory function, and look at this scaling pattern." She pointed to patches on Kavitha's arms where the scales seemed to be flaking away. "I've never seen degradation like this before." Ben hovered near the door, feeling useless but unable to leave. "Can you help him?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She was pulling up diagnostic equipment, attaching sensors to Kavitha's chest and temples. Screens flickered to life showing readings that meant nothing to Ben but made both doctors exchange worried glances. "Where did you find him?" Rachel asked without looking up. "Palace maintenance corridor. He was alone, unconscious. The palace doctors wouldn't treat him because I touched him. They said he was contaminated." Dr. Hayes shook his head in disgust. "Contaminated? That purity nonsense has killed more dragons than any disease. Rachel, look at these metabolic readings. His system is shutting down." Rachel leaned closer to the screens, her finger tracing lines of data. "His body isn't processing nutrients properly. The cellular breakdown is accelerating. It's like his own biology is attacking itself." She turned to Ben suddenly. "How long was he alone in that corridor?" "I don't know. Could have been hours, maybe longer. The dust around him hadn't been disturbed." "Hours?" Rachel's jaw tightened. She pulled up another screen, typing rapidly. "Hayes, pull up the Dragon Medical Database. Cross-reference metabolic disorders with juvenile presentations and scale degradation." While Dr. Hayes worked at the computer terminal, Rachel continued her examination. She drew blood samples, checked Kavitha's reflexes, examined his eyes and mouth with a small light. Every few seconds she'd glance at the monitors tracking his vital signs, and each time her frown deepened. "Got something," Hayes said. "There's a condition called Draconic Metabolic Deficiency Syndrome. Extremely rare. Affects maybe 1 in 50,000 dragon births. The symptoms match perfectly." Rachel moved to read over his shoulder. "Why haven't I heard of this?" "Because dragon medical literature barely acknowledges it exists. Look at the treatment protocols. There aren't any. The condition is classified as a genetic impurity. Dragons who develop it are considered defective. Most medical texts recommend isolation and palliative care only." Ben felt sick to his stomach. "You're saying they just let kids die from this? On purpose?" Rachel's expression was grim. "Not on purpose exactly. They just refuse to study it or develop treatments because acknowledging the condition means acknowledging genetic imperfection in dragon bloodlines. It's a cultural blind spot that costs lives." "But you can treat it, right?" Ben pressed. "There has to be something you can do." Hayes was already scrolling through more data. "The condition affects how dragon bodies metabolize certain minerals that are essential for scale production and cellular regeneration. Without proper treatment, the body essentially starves itself even while eating. The breakdown accelerates until complete system failure." Rachel began pulling medications from a locked cabinet. "We've treated similar metabolic disorders in other species. The principle should be the same. We need to supplement what his body can't process and stabilize his cellular regeneration." Hayes, prep and 4-line. "We'll start with a broad-spectrum mineral infusion and adjust based on his response." The two doctors worked in synchronized harmony, the kind that came from years of partnership. They inserted 4 lines, administered medications, adjusted equipment settings. Ben watched from his corner, feeling utterly helpless. Outside he could hear sirens approaching. The palace guards would be here soon. "Rachel," he said quietly. "They're coming for me." For him. She didn't look up from her work. "Let them come." I'm not stopping treatment because some guards want to enforce stupid purity laws. This boy is my patient now. Dr. Hayes glanced at the door nervously. Rachel, those are Imperial guards. They could shut us down. They could arrest all of us. Then they'll have to arrest a doctor in the middle of treating a dying patient. See how that plays in the lower city news feeds. Rachel checked the flow and adjusted a medication dosage. Besides, I took an oath. Remember? To treat anyone who needs help, regardless of species, status, or politics. That includes dragon princes whose own people have abandoned them. Ben could see the tension in both doctors, but neither of them stopped working. They were risking everything, their clinic, their careers, maybe their freedom, to help a child that Dragon Society had written off as defective. Kavith stirred slightly on the table, the first movement Ben had seen from him in over an hour. A small whimper escaped his lips. Rachel leaned close to the prince's ear. You're safe now, sweetheart. We've got you. Just rest and let the medicine work. The sirens outside grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Heavy boots thundered on the street outside the clinic. Through the small window, Ben could see Imperial guards forming a perimeter around the building. The waiting room erupted in panicked voices as patients realized what was happening. Dr. Hayes moved to stand beside Rachel, his fear evident but his resolve firm. Well, I guess we're about to find out how serious they are about those purity laws. Rachel never took her eyes off her patient. They can wait until I'm done. This boy comes first. Retry. The wall of the clinic exploded inward. Not literally, but the doors burst open with such force that the frames splintered and chunks of plaster rained down from the ceiling. Imperial guards flooded into the small waiting room, their armor gleaming even in the dim fluorescent lighting. Patients screamed and scattered, pressing themselves against the walls as the guards formed precise formations throughout the space. Then he entered. Emperor Zrath was easily 9 feet tall, his scales a deep crimson that seemed to glow with an inner fire. His eyes burned gold, and when he moved, the air itself seemed to ripple with the power he carried. He wore armor that looked ancient, etched with symbols Ben couldn't read, and a cape that dragged across the floor like liquid shadow. This wasn't just any dragon. This was the being who ruled a quarter of the known galaxy. Ben stepped in front of the exam room door, blocking it with his body. His legs felt like water and his heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to bow, to beg for mercy. He did none of those things. You need to wait, Ben said, surprised his voice didn't shake. The doctors are treating your son. He's stable but still critical. The Emperor's eyes fixed on Ben with an intensity that felt like being caught in a spotlight. Guards moved to seize Ben, but Zrath raised one clawed hand and they froze. You, the Emperor said, his voice resonating through the entire building. You are the human who contaminated my son. Who stole him from the palace. Who violated every law and protocol of my empire. Yes, sir, Ben replied. I did all those things. And I'd do them again because your son was dying alone in a maintenance corridor and no one else seemed to care. A dangerous rumble emanated from the Emperor's chest. The temperature in the room seemed to rise by several degrees. You dare suggest that I do not care for my own child? I'm suggesting your doctors refused to treat him because I carried him to them. They said he needed purification rituals that would take days. He didn't have days. He didn't have hours. Ben met the Emperor's burning gaze. So yeah, I broke your laws. I'm just a janitor who couldn't stand by and watch a kid die when I could do something about it. The exam room door opened behind Ben. Dr. Rachel Mitchell stepped out, her white coat stained with medicine and dragon blood. She looked tired but calm, and she positioned herself beside Ben, facing down the Emperor of the Draconian Empire without flinching. Your son is stabilized, she said in a professional tone. He's sleeping now. The crisis has passed, but he'll need continued treatment for several weeks, possibly months. Emperor Zratha's eyes shifted to her. You are the physician? Dr. Rachel Mitchell. This is my clinic. That's my patient in there. She crossed her arms. And before you say anything about contamination or purity laws, I need to tell you something about your son's condition. You will tell me nothing until... He has draconic metabolic deficiency syndrome, Rachel continued, cutting off the Emperor of half the galaxy like she was correcting a student. It's a genetic condition that affects how dragon bodies process essential minerals. Without treatment, it's fatal. With treatment, it's completely manageable. The Emperor went very still. That condition does not exist. It is a myth perpetuated by... It's not a myth. It's real, it's documented, and your medical establishment refuses to acknowledge it because treating it means admitting that genetic imperfections exist in dragon bloodlines. Rachel pulled out a data pad and thrust it toward the Emperor. I've spent the last hour reviewing dragon medical literature. Do you know how many young dragons have died from this condition in the past decade? 73. 73 children, all from noble families, all written off as weak or defective. All of them could have been saved with basic treatment. The Emperor took the data pad with claws that could have crushed it to powder. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. The seconds stretched into minutes. No one in the clinic dared to breathe. Finally Zrath spoke. My advisors told me Kavith was sickly. Weak. They said it was shameful for a son of mine to show such frailty. They recommended. He paused, and for the first time something like pain crossed his features. They recommended I distance myself from him. For the good of the Empire. To avoid the embarrassment of a defective heir. So you did, Ben said quietly. You listened to them instead of listening to your instincts as a father. The Emperor's head snapped toward Ben, and for a moment Ben thought he'd gone too far. But Zrath didn't lash out. Instead, his shoulders sagged slightly, and he suddenly looked less like an all-powerful ruler and more like a father who'd made a terrible mistake. May I see him? The Emperor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel stepped aside. He's sleeping. Don't wake him. His body needs rest to heal. Emperor Zrath had to duck to fit through the exam room doorway. Ben and Rachel followed cautiously. Inside, Prince Kavith lay on the exam table, looking impossibly small beneath the medical equipment. His scales had regained some of their color, though they were still pale. And 4-line ran into his arm, and monitors beeped steadily, tracking his vital signs. The Emperor approached slowly as if afraid he might break something. He reached out one massive claw and gently touched his son's forehead. Kavith stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw his father, a small smile crossed his face. Papa, Kavith whispered. I had the strangest dream. There was a kind man who carried me when I was scared. Not a dream, Zrath said softly. That man is real. He saved your life. Kavith's eyes drifted to Ben, standing near the door. Thank you, the prince said, his voice weak but sincere. Then his gaze shifted to something on the nearby counter. A deck of cards that Dr. Hayes kept in the exam room for nervous patients. Do you know how to play cards? Ben blinked, surprised by the question. He looked at Rachel, who nodded slightly. He moved to the table and picked up the deck. Yeah, I know a few games. You feeling up to it? Just something simple, Kavith said. The adults always want to talk about important things. I just want to be a regular kid for a little while. So Ben taught a dragon prince how to play Go Fish while the Emperor of the Draconian Empire watched in silence. Kavith laughed when he won a round, the sound bright and clear and completely at odds with the tense situation. It was the laugh of a child who'd forgotten for just a moment that he was supposed to be strong and perfect and imperial. Emperor Zrath watched his son smile and play and act like the child he was, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. When Kavith finally dozed off again, exhausted from even that small activity, the Emperor turned to Rachel. How many other children suffer from this condition right now? In your empire? Based on statistical projections, probably 200 or 300. Rachel met his gaze steadily. Most won't get treatment because dragon physicians don't recognize the condition. Their families will be told to accept their children's weakness. Those kids will die and everyone will pretend it was inevitable. The Emperor's claws clenched into fists. That ends today. The announcement came 3 days later, broadcast across every communication channel in the Draconian Empire. Emperor Zrath stood before the assembled Galactic Council, his son Kavith beside him, looking healthier than he had in months. The young prince's scales gleamed with renewed vitality, and he stood tall, though he kept glancing at his father with a mixture of pride and nervousness. I come before you today not as an emperor, but as a father who nearly lost his son, Zrath began, his voice carrying to billions of viewers across dozens of star systems. I was taught that strength defines our species. That perfection is the mark of nobility. That any flaw, any weakness, diminishes the dragon bloodline and brings shame upon our houses. He paused, and Ben, watching from the small apartment he'd been temporarily housed in, could see the struggle on the Emperor's face. I was wrong, Zrath continued. These beliefs nearly cost me my child. Worse, they have cost our empire 73 young lives in the past decade alone. Children who died not from incurable diseases, but from our pride. From our refusal to acknowledge that sometimes, dragons need help just like any other living being. The council chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Ben could see dragon nobles shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. But Zrath pressed on. My son lives today because a human janitor named Ben Carter showed more courage and compassion than my entire royal court. When my own physicians refused to treat Kavith, citing contamination and purity laws, this human carried my son through the streets to a clinic in the lower city. He risked his life, his freedom, everything to save a child he'd never met. The camera panned to Ben, and he felt his face flush as billions of eyes suddenly focused on him. He'd never wanted attention. He just wanted to help a sick kid. Therefore, the Emperor declared, I am announcing the immediate establishment of the Cross-Species Medical Research Institute. Dr. Rachel Mitchell and her team will lead this organization, which will study and treat conditions that our pride has prevented us from addressing. All dragon medical facilities will be required to participate. All young dragons showing symptoms of draconic metabolic deficiency syndrome will receive immediate treatment, regardless of their family's status or ability to pay. The chamber exploded with voices, some supportive, many angry. One elderly dragon noble stood, his scales nearly white with age. Your Majesty, this is madness. To place human doctors in charge of dragon medicine? To admit genetic weakness exists in our bloodlines? The shame. The shame is in letting children die, Zrath roared, his voice silencing the entire chamber. The shame is in caring more about appearances than lives. The shame is in teaching our young that they must be perfect or they are worthless. He placed a hand on Kavitha's shoulder. My son is not perfect. He has a condition that will require treatment for the rest of his life. And he is no less worthy of love, of respect, of dignity because of it. Ben felt something tighten in his chest. He'd never expected this. He just wanted to save one kid, and now an entire empire was changing because of it. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Dr. Rachel Mitchell's clinic was transformed into a state-of-the-art research facility, though Rachel insisted on keeping the original clinic operating for the lower city residents who depended on it. Funding poured in from the Imperial Treasury. Dr. Hayes found himself leading a team of both dragon and human physicians, working together to develop better treatments for the metabolic disorder. Ben received more than a dozen job offers from noble families wanting him as a personal attendant or bodyguard or various other positions that came with impressive titles and even more impressive salaries. He turned them all down. Prince Kavith himself asked Ben to become his companion and tutor, offering him rooms in the palace and a position in the royal household. Ben met with the young prince in one of the palace gardens, a place where Kavith now spent his afternoons recovering and building his strength back. The boy looked disappointed when Ben explained his decision. You're not going to stay? Kavith asked, his voice small. But I thought we were friends. We are friends, Ben said, sitting down on the garden bench beside the prince. But buddy, I'm not a palace guy. I wouldn't know what to do with fancy titles and servants and all that. Besides, I've got my own work to do. Cleaning? Kavith looked confused. But you could do anything now. You're famous. Everyone knows your name. Ben smiled. Yeah, and that's exactly why I need to get back to regular life. See, I'm not special, Kavith. I'm just a guy who saw someone who needed help and did something about it. The real problem is that everyone acted like that was extraordinary when it should just be normal. But the Emperor is giving you anything you want. He's funding clinics in your name. And that's great. Really great. Ben leaned back, looking up at the artificial sky above the garden dome. But I don't need a palace apartment or a fancy job. What I need is for the Emperor's offer to fund medical clinics throughout the lower city. Places where people who can't afford expensive treatments can get help. Places where species doesn't matter, only need. Kavith thought about this for a moment. So you're going back to cleaning? For now. Maybe I'll help out at one of those new clinics sometimes. I'm pretty good at talking to scared kids, turns out. Ben ruffled the prince's hair gently, earning a laugh. But mostly I'm going back because there are other people who need help. Other forgotten corners where someone might be alone and scared. And someone needs to be paying attention to those places. News of Ben's decision spread quickly, and it seemed to resonate with people across the empire in ways that his dramatic rescue hadn't. Here was someone who'd been offered wealth and power and prestige, and he'd walked away from it to go back to mopping floors and helping people who couldn't offer him anything in return. The story became something bigger than just one janitor and one prince. It became a reminder that existed in 1,000 different languages across 100 different worlds. Parents told their children about the human who cared more about doing what was right than about being rewarded for it. Teachers used it as an example of true compassion. Even other species, ones who had nothing to do with the Draconian Empire, heard the story and shared it. 6 months later, Ben was back at work in the palace, pushing his cleaning cart through the marble corridors. But things were different now. The maintenance corridors were better lit and regularly patrolled. Medical stations had been set up throughout the palace, staffed by doctors who'd been trained to recognize the symptoms of metabolic disorders and other conditions. Dragon nobles nodded to him in the hallways, though Ben suspected that had less to do with respect and more to do with fear of what the Emperor might do if they didn't. Kavith visited him sometimes, sneaking away from his tutors to help Ben clean or just to talk. The prince was thriving now, his scales brilliant and strong, his energy boundless. He talked about wanting to study medicine when he was older, about wanting to help other kids who felt different or broken. One afternoon, as they cleaned windows together in one of the upper galleries, Kavith asked the question that had apparently been bothering him for months. Ben, do you ever regret it? Not taking the rewards? You could have been rich. Ben squeezed out his cleaning cloth and wiped down another section of glass. You know what I've learned, kid? The measure of a civilization isn't in its palaces or its power or how fancy its technology is. It's in how it treats the people that everyone else forgets about. The sick kids in maintenance corridors. The patients in lower city clinics. The folks doing jobs that nobody notices until they're not done. He gestured out the window at the sprawling city below, where new medical facilities were being built, where species of all kinds lived and worked together. All this didn't happen because I'm special. It happened because one person decided to care, and that made other people realize they could care too. That's worth more than any amount of money. Kavith nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his young eyes. So it's not about the one big heroic thing. It's about all the small everyday things. Exactly, Ben said with a smile. It's about showing up, paying attention, and giving a damn about people even when no one's watching or rewarding you for it. That's the kind of strength that actually matters. The prince went back to cleaning, working alongside the janitor who'd saved his life, and in that simple act, the true change in the empire was visible. Not in the new laws or the research facilities or the reformed medical practices, but in a young dragon prince who'd learned that compassion wasn't weakness, that needing help wasn't shame, and that the measure of a person wasn't in their perfection but in their humanity.